My name is Lauren Nye, and I am the Associate Curator here at the Hunter, and I will let Pam and Tim introduce themselves as well.
I'm Pam Reed, and I'm the Executive Director of the Houston Museum of Decorative Arts.
And I'm Tim Barnett, and I am the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Houston Museum of Decorative Arts.
Yes, and thank you to all the Houston Museum neighbors and friends who are here with us tonight as well. We're going to talk a bit about the exhibit, talk about the special works from the Houston Museum's collection that are here. And I think I'll just start by giving us some historical context for this exhibit, and then we can talk more about the collection. So what's, I think, really important to think about whenever we're talking about Art Deco is sort of placing it historically. And I think a good benchmark for that is that Art Deco, as we know it, really started about at the end of World War I and ended kind of at the beginning of World War II. So that is that very specific sort of time in history that we're looking at here. And prior to the rise of Art Deco, what was most popular was Art Nouveau, which I think many of us have sort of a visualization of what Art Nouveau was. I think there's a good example here on the wall, the two images. The one on the top is a very classic Art Nouveau piece of art, and then the one below is an Art Deco advertisement. So you can see like sort of the juxtaposition of styles. Art Nouveau was very organic and flowing, very sort of carefree and focused on beauty and bringing beauty into the home. Art Nouveau really became a style that was made functional through lots of functional objects, including glass, and we'll see some of that here. And post-World War I, artists were really looking for a different means of expression. That sort of carefree beauty and organic nature of Art Nouveau didn't really fit anymore, especially for lots of these studios that were based in Europe. So imagine, being a glass studio in France or Germany or England or Eastern Europe during World War I, the upheaval that many of these artists lived through, and some didn't live through because they were conscripted into military service. So coming out of that, artists were looking for a new way to express themselves, and they were sort of turning their backs on this prior style, kind of in the way that art styles cycle. And what they began looking for was a much more modern, more hard-edged style of creating artwork. And that permeated into functional objects as well. And so all of this work is from the Museum of Glass in Tacoma, Washington. It is a promised gift by an artist, a glass artist, and a collector. And these pieces really span that end of Art Nouveau through Art Deco. So I think that it's important as you look, sort of imagine and notice those hints of both. Like we can see perhaps right behind you there. And like in that case as well, what we're seeing are images of plants. So touching on that organic, but it's suddenly being depicted in a bit more of a geometric style, a bit more hard-edged, flattened into solid shapes. The smaller piece in that case is one of my favorites, and you may not immediately recognize the organic influence, but what it is fiddlehead ferns unraveling as they grow. But when you look at it, the artists are choosing a very angular, very geometric way to depict them. So that's a good way to sort of think of this shift in style. You'll see lots of plants and animals, human form as well, lots of fish, and think about that era and think about what it meant to have these objects in your home, what you would use them for, because these pieces were very much made to be functional. Glass work is very different than making all other types of artwork. It's very collaborative. It happens in a studio, and these pieces could be made in multiples. Some of them in much larger groups of multiples, and some in smaller groups, but they were all made to be used in the home. The collector, David Huchthausen, as most of you probably maybe know a collector or are familiar with a collection, he's an artist himself, but he also collects many different types of things, and he has throughout his whole life, from playing cards to folk art to glass, but he really fell in love with glass working as a student in the Pacific Northwest, which is where sort of the American studio glass movement has its roots. So this is all just a very small portion of his overall collection, which will be gifted to the Museum of Glass in Tacoma. But I think that's a great segue for Pam and Tim to start talking about their collection.
Yeah, so we have the collection of one woman. Our museum is located just across the street in a house from the 1800s. And I actually learned when I was doing some research for this talk that David Huchthausen he passed away he was born in 1951, and Anna actually passed away in 1951. So they like missed each other. They were born in different centuries, but they both just like to collect beautiful things. Anna was originally from Arkansas, and she moved to Chattanooga in the early 1900s. And she originally had a women's boutique. She actually sold hats and hair accessories and perfume bottles and things of that sort. And then she went on to collect used furniture, mostly made in Tennessee, and then art, mostly glass and pottery from all over the world, although she never left the U.S. She traveled only in the U.S. and also Mexico and Canada, but she collected pieces from all over the world, similar to David Huchthausen. So there was a lot of similarities and the differences because of the time that she lived. She collected mostly Victorian items as well as Art Nouveau, and that's where we saw a really nice connection between our collection and the collection that's at the Hunter today.
And just going ahead with what Pam was talking about in her collection, we have brought over some pieces that are very special and does bridge that connection into 4 categories. One category being caged, another category being spangled glass, another category being cameo glass, and then a final category of opalescent glass. So we have a case here tonight of those special pieces that are part of Miss Anna's collection.
And you'll notice the pedestal here that's from the Houston Museum's collection, so we can sort of gather, and you'll see those overlap in styles, especially the caged work. This is a great example of the caged work from the Art Deco Glass show. Sort of mixing metal and glass is such a classic combination because they both get worked mostly when they're hot and more pliable. So the artist collaborated with metal workers to create the cage that the glass was then blown into. So it's impossible to separate one from the other. They become one object.
And ours have also become one object, but they were done in a different order. Our caged piece here was actually a blown glass pitcher, and then the metalwork was attached by hand. So they would warm it, and then they would solder it piece by piece and wrap it around the piece, and it even wraps onto the bottom. It's really quite beautiful. So.
Also, we've got, in this case here, we've got some beautiful opalescent pieces. Opalescent glass, very important to recognize, they were utilitarian objects as well, such as barber bottles, as well as decorative objects. One pattern in the barber bottle there is the fern design, and I know that Lauren had mentioned a fern design earlier. So that fern design just shows how in this time period it carries over.
And because Anna, one of her earlier jobs, she actually worked as a hair model and traveled all over the U.S. And that's really how she got the exposure to sort of like the finer things in life, coming from Arkansas in that time period. So we brought those pieces specifically just to relate back to her sort of roots and how she probably got started learning about art by traveling all over. So that those pieces are here just as a little nod to Anna's history.
And then our cameo glass. Our cameo glass is represented here in the case. We want to pay special attention to the Val St. Lambert piece, which is French, and then also the tall cameo vase. Cameo glass was recognized, and when we think about it, especially in our collection, we think about Harry Northwood. And Harry Northwood's father, John, was instrumental in England for making the glass Portland vase. And so when we think about, once again, making that connection, that transition, we have some beautiful examples here in the case for that.
I think before we start moving throughout the gallery, one piece that would be great to also focus on in this collection is the work that has the enameling on it, because I think we'll stop at another enameled piece if you want to highlight that one, because it does share a lot with the vase.
Sure, absolutely. The small milk pitcher here is a beautiful cased enameled glass that we can attribute probably to the American Phoenix Glass Company outside of Pittsburgh. We also know that other European companies produce that as well, but we feel sure that that's probably more than likely where that piece came from. It has a very unusual square top, and once again, just making the connection and how the decoration goes into that, loops over into that caged piece.
Can I ask a question?
Please,
Sure.
yeah.
Can you explain what cameo glass is?
Yeah, it's layers of glass that they then use in acid and then they hand etch away. So there are blown pieces, and then they blow layers of glass basically around each other and then carve away to create the different layers.
So they carve away, they don't put it in acid.
Well, they use an acid to assist with the carving.
Yes. Yeah. So you would have the body of the work, for example, in the white or the clear and purple piece, similarly to, for example, these pieces or many of the pieces in this broader exhibit. You would create the structure in a color, for example, that one would be the clear, and you would coat it in a resist. And then you would create the design in that resist. It's almost like if you've ever made a woodblock print or carved a stamp out of a piece of linoleum, you're removing the background. And so where everything is exposed, after you've removed that layer, then you put it in the acid bath, and the acid eats away at the surface. So these artists played with the length of time it was in the acid, the depth of the etch that they wanted. And so, exactly. So when you have multiple layers of different colors and you know the chemical process well, then you can choose how and when to expose all of those different layers. And it's amazing to think that, they were going to that length to create these works, but then also making them in multiples, so that you could have an edition or a grouping that would be sold together, or people would want part of a certain line that all matched in their home. Because it is easy, now we think of things as a bit more disposable, but all of these works were made at a time when plastic was not available. These were functional objects in the home, and because they were made in multiples, they were a bit more affordable than one-of-a-kind luxury items. And so that kind of brought the ability to a more upper middle class, but a more middle class sensibility of people who wanted things that looked like one-of-a-kind luxury items but couldn't quite afford them, or they were interested in collecting unique and beautiful things for their homes, and things like the works on view here made that a little more possible and accessible for them. Yeah. And I think before we start walking a bit, maybe just take a close look at this enameled piece, and then we're going to stop at another enameled piece, and we can talk a bit about what that technique is like, because it's a totally different type of design work on the surface of the glass. So, if you took a close look at that enamel process on the milk pitcher, it almost looks like painting on the surface of glass, right? But painting on the surface of glass is never as long lasting as something like enamel, because you really want that bond on the surface to last and withstand. So this is a good example of that exact same technique, and of course it's birds as well. But as we talked about, you start with the body of your piece. So like in this Le Grand vase, they started with the larger piece. And it requires quite a bit of heat to work with glass of this thickness. And so it's a very hot furnace that a work like this would have been made in, using different colored glass embedded in the piece. And then to create this enameled design on the surface of the work, similarly to the picture, enamel is created, and you may have done this, like some people have little enamel like kilns at school, but you essentially make what kind of becomes an original paint almost. You take incredibly finely ground and colored glass and you mix it with a binding agent, something thick. So you're almost making your own sort of paint, but it's really made out of incredibly fine glass suspended in a binder. And then using brushes of different sizes, like when you look closely at this one, there's teeny tiny lines on that surface. So, similarly to painting, you paint on that enamel on the surface, and when you have it just right, you put it back in the heat, but at a much lower temperature, because you don't want to affect the shape that you've already perfected. And that heat at a lower temperature causes those teeny tiny pieces of glass to essentially melt and bond together with that binding, and it sort of sticks them to the surface of the glass. So whereas a paint can chip off much easier on a smooth surface, this actually sort of melds the two together and it becomes one. And I think Anna has quite a bit of enameled glass.
We have a lot of enameled glass in the collection. Yeah, we chose that piece just for the nod to nature. And then also the case back here in the corner has a lot of the metallic within the cameo glass. We don't have any pieces quite like that, but we brought pieces with a similar technique, the metallic blown into the glass. And so that's why we selected those for tonight.
And you can see, these are just such stunning examples of that acid etching process, where you have variations in the background of the work itself, and then that top layer of glass, which the design was etched into, and then the artists go back and polished those raised points so they really catch your eye and shine, and intentionally leaving that secondary layer a little bit more matte so that you have that beautiful difference. And I think it's interesting to note, the design on something like these works is a little shallow. If you run your hand over it, it doesn't raise a whole lot. So it wasn't in the acid bath for very long. But pieces like these here to my right, if you look closely at those, the edge is very deep, like 1/4 of an inch deep. And so glass studios were really adept at mixing chemicals just right and testing how long they wanted them to be in the etching process. And you can control the depth and variations in the depth if you put them back in multiple times. So it is kind of a layering process that happens. And you can see some really varied examples of different depths in some of the pieces in this work. And you can also see that transition into the geometric as well, especially with things like these, that monochromatic geometric look that people were really interested in. And it's definitely a nod to what is coming in that sort of modernist style of art making. So on the upper shelf here to the left, if you look closely, you'll notice some inclusion in the glass that has a metallic nature, and that ties into some of your work as well.
Right, and so when we think about that on the piece that we brought over, we're thinking about what's called spangled glass, and it has little pieces, tiny pieces of mica suspended in that, and so it gives that metallic look. It gives it some depth. It gives it a dimension that is very unique in the fact that it in ways it takes it beyond what we would even call spatter glass. So spatter glass when we think about that, would be like tiny droplets of color. But adding that mica to make it more spangled, and with the metallic was something for that time period, very important to be able to look at.
And like Lauren mentioned earlier about the cameo glass, a lot of the pieces that Anna collected, the glass makers, it was a big time for experimentation and invention of new colors and new techniques. There was a lot of freedom in the factories to some extent. So, you know, adding the cage around a piece or blowing it into a cage, or adding some of the metallic into the glass, or our Barber bottles that are cranberry glass, they actually used real gold in the glass when it was hot so that it created that pink color. You know, that was something they hadn't done before. So it's just sort of a new exploration and technique at this time period.
Absolutely. And you can sort of see, like, this case is a good example of that shifting style. They're thinking about organic shapes, but in a different way, like not representing, you know, animals or the human figure even, but thinking about how to make sort of more of a free form object, as well as repeated geometric patterns, which become very important in that classic Art Deco and modernism style. Kind of stepping even further away from representation and thinking about how, like, that pure shape and form can express, you know, the ideas and also the style that collectors were looking for. So you can see some great examples of these, like, sort of repeated, beautiful patterns. Like in this red vase here, that is called water lily vase. But I think you have to, seeing that title, you have to look at it somewhat creatively to see what that reference is. But the artists were still, of course, referencing nature, but it's something that they're even further abstracting away from naturalistic representation. And then we get into some of these even more classic Art Deco objects, like in the case here and on the wall, that are just pure flat shape and color, which is that sort of next progression. As we think about even sort of into like the 1960s and the more mod style, in the same way that sort of styles are cyclical and things come back, you know, artists even now are looking back at this era and thinking about color blocking and patterning. So these are just very classic examples. And you'll see in some of these other cases in this space, the Czechoslovakian glass studios were particularly well known for the way that they made glass and their experimentation with glass. So for example, you can see in that case, there's some green and blue glass, and it looks like it was carved from stone. It's sort of called like lapis glass or malachite. And it looks so much like stone because of the way that they were putting the color into the glass whenever it was hot and working with it. And they were making these unbelievable recreations of that surface style. Do you want to open it up for questions? Do you want to touch on anything in particular about the Houston collection that we haven't yet?
I just would say that, you know, the pieces that Anna collected are earlier than these pieces, so it was just interesting to see the influence of how the Victorian and then into the Art Nouveau and then into the Art Deco and how it just all sort of flows. And like she was saying about abstracting the water lily, I think you said, you know, looking at it with a different eye, more abstract eye than where in the Victorian times it was much more literal, you know, it was an actual bird or an actual flower, where here you have to like use your imagination a bit more. So it's just a nice evolution, like our collection compared to his collection, just to kind of see how the pieces have inspired each other. And like Lauren said, you know, you always go back, you know, trends come and go. So to see it even in this time period of how they inspired each other is really, you know, really fascinating.
Yeah.
And when you think about her life from 1876 to 1951, it truly covers those three time periods.
Yeah, she lived through it.
Yeah, she lived through it, so she experienced it. And so, you know, she just had a natural eye for beauty, and she knew what to buy or what to collect. And I think she was able to distinctly pick that out in those different periods.
Yeah, it is amazing to think that, you know, Anna was living through all of the time periods that we've looked at in the Art Deco and how she would have seen these And at the time, sometimes we don't recognize something that will be valued 100 years from now. And think about what those things are that looking back, people will think these are art objects. These are like amazing designer objects that an artist really spent a lot of time on. And she definitely had that eye and was thinking so much further afield than just, where she lived. The breadth of that collection is really, really particularly unique, I think, for our area. Oh yes, talk about that.
We got a new building over there. We're going to be creating, a new space, and it's just a part of what we do is art. All this started by the aesthetic movement, the arts and crafts movement that built into the Art Nouveau, then into the Art Deco. So it wasn't like we just woke up and there's Art Deco. We were building on that, starting with the aesthetic movement, the arts and crafts movements and so forth. And then as we get into the Art Nouveau, and then things start getting critical again.
Yes.
And so our thoughts and minds get critical. And culturally, we always go back to those things that make us feel good. So in the 20s, we had the flappers, and we had bobbed hair, and we had short skirts, and we were dancing in Charleston. And in the 60s, we had tweed and mini skirts, and we're dancing in the discos. So we find those things culturally that make us feel good. Things are kind of weird out there. And Art Deco is one of those. So we see it, a return on it now, which is a little scary, because we gravitate as people to those things that make us feel good. And this kind of work makes us feel good. It makes us feel elevated, and it takes our mind off the other things.
Absolutely. I think that it's always important to remember, no matter what type of art you're looking at, art is a reflection of the world around us. Art history is a reflection of world history. And when you can think of those contexts, whenever you're viewing something, it can only help inform your understanding of sort of the world that these artists were working in, this extreme moment of upheaval, because the earlier pieces in the show are from European studios, but there are later pieces in this collection that are from American studios. And in that way that we think of, especially during the 18 and early 1900s, where America was maybe 10, 15 years behind on the trend of art in Europe, that same thing happened. And then we look at what the American studios like Steuben and Tiffin were creating, and that directly informed, what was happening in Corning, New York, and Corning Glass, and what was happening in the Pacific Northwest. And the next step really from these later works is the artists starting to think about well, why don't we just make artwork purely out of glass and remove it from function? So then it becomes about sculptural, really. And you can see some examples of it in this show, but not at the scale that artists are working now. Even artists like David Huchthausen, who I would encourage you to look up his work. I have his website is listed on the text panel about him. But his work looks completely different than this work, totally and completely different. And he's working purely in glass and thinking about, layering color and color blocking and sort of the optics of looking into glass. And so it's really a direct build on all of those things that leads us to where we are now. So it's always helpful to look at the different eras of work and really help understand where these pieces come from.
I think it's a good point too, because at the time, like you were saying earlier, we weren't such a throwaway nation. We were using these pieces and passing them down. Where now, how it's become more sculptural, because you can get a vase, at Target or something, and you don't have to invest your whole paycheck to buy one piece that you're going to treasure forever. So it has really affected just the way artists make their works today.
Yeah. Absolutely. Very few of us have dedicated sculptures in our home. More of us should, but few of us do. And this era, we're really about that. You'll notice some of these pieces aren't necessarily functional, but they are purely more aesthetic, but they're small because they wanted them to be accessible for people who wanted beautiful things in their home that fit with the trend at the time. And it's interesting to think about the lives that each one of these pieces have lived, because David didn't buy them from the factory. He came across them through, different auction houses and individual purchases, and they all had this life that led to the same place. And it's interesting to think about about how they were all made around the same time and had their own adventures and then ended up here. So, something to think about. Well, thank you. Thank you all. Please ask questions if you've got them.